Hello and welcome back to the mines, everybody. Welcome back to Deep Rock Galactic Survivor, where today we're going to be taking a look at each of the classes and we're going to be ranking them. So currently there is 3 subclasses within each class of dwarves in Deep Rock Galactic Survivor, where each of these can be unlocked by a total level that is completed just by leveling up any of the characters or all of the characters. Either way, this counts towards your total level. And since the subclasses can vary so much, I don't know if it's really necessarily fair to put it in like an S to D tier. So instead I have these 3 categories that we're going to be separating them in. Our very first one is very consistent. This is pretty self-explanatory. These are the classes that are the most consistent, or that I find the most consistent. Generally, they have pretty good effects on them, and they start out with a pretty good starting weapon, so they do fairly well. You can still have hiccups with them, and you can still get beat with them, certainly, especially on the higher hazard difficulties, but for the most part, they're pretty consistent. Our next one is hit or miss. These ones are the classes that are, well, more hit or miss. Sometimes they can be absolutely incredible. They can be extremely strong. If you high roll with them, they can just demolish everything, sometimes better than the more consistent classes. However, there is chances where you just low roll them and you don't really do the most amount of damage, or your build is kind of weird or janky and it feels a little bit awkward. They can still work really well, but sometimes I find these classes to be a little bit harder to use. And then we have the sometimes struggle tier, where sometimes you just struggle with these classes. Sometimes you just don't get that great of setup for them. Sometimes you don't have great effects on them. Sometimes these classes benefit heavily from certain weapon types, and if you don't get those weapons offered to you and you don't have any money to reroll your stuff, you just end up struggling through the round, and I find them to be the most difficult to work with. However, all of these classes can still be really good. They all can beat Hazard 5. I think I've beaten Hazard 5 with all of these classes. Probably not in every biome, but at least in most of the biomes I've been able to do this, especially with certain classes, the very consistent ones. So let's talk about each of these and go over what their pros, cons, and starting weapons are. So our very first one is Classic Scout. And Classic Scout is unlocked right as the very start of the game. It's the one class that is unlocked. You get the other classes unlocked after you level them up. And Classic Scout comes with the GK2 assault rifle as their primary weapon, which overall is a pretty decent starting weapon. The GK2 is very consistent. It's a very general purpose weapon that does well against everything. You can build it in a multitude of ways and it works really well in pretty much any way that you want to. I'm never really disappointed when I see the GK2 show up. It's a fine enough weapon for the Scout. Probably not one of the strongest overall weapons, but definitely not one of the weakest. It's like right in the middle of the pack, or a little bit above average overall. Classic Scout also starts out with 2 passives, where they get 10% movement speed, and they also get 20 maximum HP. Movement speed is nice, especially in this game where moving around quickly can get you out of a lot of situations, a lot of bad situations, and plus 20 maximum HP is decent, makes it so you're a little bit tankier than the other Scout classes. Not too much. 20 HP doesn't really matter too very much on the very high difficulties. I'd still rather have more HP than not enough HP, but 20 HP isn't the most. Classic Scout I find to be decent overall, but probably the most difficult of the Scout classes to actually use. So I'm going to put them into the sometimes struggle tier. Generally, they're pretty decent, but on the higher difficulties, I do find that the GK2 sometimes just doesn't do enough damage to kill things. They're probably on the very high end of this tier, or maybe into the hit and miss tier. I don't know, we'll see at the end of this if I want to swap any of these around. But Classic Scout is a decent enough class overall, but I don't find it to be Scout's strongest out of the group that you do have. Up next, we have Recon Scout. Recon Scout can be unlocked at level 9, so once you get a total level of 9, then you unlock this class, and Recon Scout starts out with the Zukov submachine guns. These ones I don't really care for. They're not one of my favorite weapons in the game because they just fire in a cross pattern or a T pattern, so directly in front of you, directly behind you, and to the right and left of you. This makes it kind of awkward just to get a decent amount of DPS onto single targets. It's pretty good for crowd control, or at least it can be decent for crowd control. It depends. A lot of the time you're just shooting with the thing behind you, because sometimes you'll be mining, and if you're on a wall, your left and right probably aren't doing that much damage, and your straight forward isn't really doing anything because you're likely looking towards the wall to mine. The Zukovs do get better as they level up. They can actually be really strong once they're fully leveled out, and you can have like the spinning bullets on them. Those can actually be pretty good, and they're fairly flexible, where you can put like lightning and cryo on them. So they're actually pretty good, at least in the late game, but you do have to get to the late game in order to use those. Recon Scout's unique passive is that you get a plus 25% dodge chance, which is really good. Scout already has base dodge chance, so that's just a chance to not take any sort of damage, as well as whenever you do dodge, then Scout moves 35% faster and reloads 35% faster for the next 5 seconds. This one I'm definitely going to put up into the hit or miss, because Recon Scout can be absolutely amazing. You can get really high rolls and get the Zhukovs maxed out right away, and you have a very solid weapon. Sometimes you get some really solid weapons that are given to you, like you get the boomstick, you get the M1000, the Drac, anything like that for Scout can be really good. Or maybe you get something like the GK2 like Classic Scout has, and then you just soup that one up and get a ton of damage on it too. But you can also get those runs where you get basically nothing, you feel like you're not doing that much damage, they're giving you a lot of passive buffs, maybe you're just not getting a whole lot of gold or nitra, or not a lot of good upgrades in between the matches. Recon Scout definitely feels like either you win a lot or you lose a lot with them, and there's not really a whole lot of in between. This also depends on the dodge chance, because sometimes you just dodge through absolutely everything and you can just rush right through gigantic crowds and have no problem. Other times your dodge just doesn't trigger at all and you just die really early on, which is disappointing. So Recon Scout, I think I'm going to put it right there. They can be good, but they can also be pretty bad. I would say that Classic Scout is more consistent than them overall, but Recon Scout definitely has higher highs and lower lows than Classic Scout does. Then we have Sharpshooter Scout. This can be unlocked at level 18 for Scout. So Sharpshooter starts out with the M1000 Classic, which is probably one of the best guns in the game currently, even so much so that the last patch, that at least was a balancing patch, it got nerfed, which it kind of deserved because this thing was really crazy. It's a really good rifle. It does a lot of damage and it has Pierce on it by default, which is really cool. It's a really strong rifle, and it's even stronger with Sharpshooter because Sharpshooter's passives are that they get 15% increased crit chance, which is a lot, especially with your already existing crit chance, so you can actually have a really high amount of crits right away, and this also gives you 50% bonus crit damage on hit. Not only that, but when you kill something with a crit, it explodes out with the excess damage hitting everything around it. So if you just max out full damage with the M1000, you can use this to pretty much clear up every single stage in the game, and it is really strong. It's probably Scout's strongest class, at least overall, so I'm going to put this up into the very consistent classes. Sharpshooter Scout is really, really good. The only kind of problem with Sharpshooter Scout is if you don't get a decent start, you don't even necessarily need a really strong start, but if you don't get a decent start, you are a little bit squishy, and on certain maps like the salt pits, it can be kind of rough with like the rollers coming by to where your M1000 might not be able to pick them off. Then we move on to Gunner. Gunner is the second dwarf that you unlock. You unlock the Weapons Specialist Gunner at level 3. This is 3 total level. And this one is kind of interesting. So this one starts out with the Leadstorm powered minigun. And this is a pretty strong weapon. The minigun actually does a lot of damage and a lot of damage per second, but it only fires directly in front of you pretty much in a cone. It's a little bit wider than that. I don't think it's quite 180 degrees, but it is wider than what you would kind of expect a cone of fire being from the minigun. That already makes the minigun a little bit awkward. Any gun that just shoots forward is going to be a little bit awkward in a game like this, and there's no upgrades to allow it to shoot in any other direction that I'm aware of. I don't think they added anything new in the most recent patch. At least I haven't seen anything. So it does get a little bit awkward there. It's really good for running and gunning with, though, because if you're just running in a straight line, there's probably going to be enemies pouring in, and the minigun can just wipe those out. And then if you have other guns that can shoot behind you, then this can actually do a lot of damage. The unique passive for Weapon Specialist Gunner is after you fired out 100 rounds in total, which is going to go out pretty fast from the minigun, then you fire out one shot that splits into 8 projectiles that does heavy damage. This is similar to like the autocannon's damage. The Weapon Specialist Gunner I find to be kind of hit or miss. I think I'd put it there, because sometimes you can really high roll with this class, and if you get all rate of fire and you get large magazines with everything, just its passive alone can clear up basically everything. It's just the starting weapon is not that great. If you end up just getting offered a whole bunch of heavy weapons that don't attack particularly fast, then it isn't as good. So it can definitely have some pretty high highs, but it can also have some really low lows. Then we have Juggernaut Gunner. Juggernaut Gunner can be unlocked at level 9 for Gunner, so you have to get Gunner up to level 9, you unlock this one. This one starts out with the Bulldog Heavy Revolver, which is a very straightforward gun. This is basically like the mini M1000. It does really high damage. It usually has long range, although Juggernaut Gunner actually cuts your range down, so that kind of hurts it. It's got good overclocks overall, nothing way crazy, but pretty solid ones, and if you want to buff it up, it's pretty good. Juggernaut Gunner's unique passives are that you get plus 10 to your total armor, which Gunner already has extra armor, so that's nice. You get plus 50 more maximum HP, so you're even tankier. You also get 10% bonus damage for 10 seconds every time that you take damage with this class, and it stacks up to 5 times. So you can wade through the enemies more easily with this class and deal high damage, but the downside is that you do have like half the total range of your weapons. That might not matter on certain weapons, because I believe things like the autocannon basically have infinite range, so cutting its range down doesn't really matter. The revolver, it kind of hurts. The coil gun, it really hurts. Some of the other weapons, it kind of hurts. You do have to get close to enemies in order to hurt them, which makes it so that this class can fluctuate quite a lot. It's pretty consistent at actually getting through the first couple waves, though. I found the Juggernaut gunner usually doesn't have too much of a trouble on like Has 5 holding through like waves 1 and 2. But it also doesn't do very well in the later rounds, assuming that you don't just get something that's really strong or you buff up one of your weapons a ton. So Juggernaut Gunner, I think I would also probably put into the hit or miss class, because sometimes it does really well and it's pretty consistent in the early game, but to the later game it doesn't do as well, I find. So I don't know, maybe I should put this in the sometimes struggle. I'll just keep it in the hit or miss, because sometimes I've done really well with Juggernaut. Other times I've done almost nothing with it, so it can kind of fluctuate a decent amount. And then our last gunner is the Heavy Weapons Gunner. And Heavy Gunner is really strong. Heavy Gunner is unlocked at level 18 for Gunner. This one starts out with the Thunderhead Heavy Autocannon, which is also one of the strongest weapons in the game. It has knockback on it by default, which is really good. It does really high damage per shot. It fires out multiple projectiles. It does have somewhat of a slow rate of fire and a slow reload speed, just like it does in the regular game of Deep Rock Galactic, but man, does it just knock everything aside. And if you max that thing out, it is crazy, especially if you stack like a ton of rate of fire and a ton of reload speed on it. You don't really need to stack damage with it. Its damage is already really high, and if you can just keep stun locking something in place just by pushing it back constantly, it does a lot of damage. Heavy Weapons Gunner's passive also makes it so you get minus 10% total movement speed, so you move slower, but you do have longer range and more reload speed with heavy weapons. So if you want to stack heavy weapons with this, it can actually be really strong. If you want to stack this with like the Shard Diffractor, the Flamethrower, the Cryo Cannon, Minigun, Breach Cutter's really strong with this one too. There's a lot of very strong weapons that you can stack on a Sludge Pump. Sludge Pump's also really good with this one. And this one I find just to be super consistent. I find Heavy Gunner to be like one of the most consistent classes. I find it the easiest to get to the final level and Has 5 with. I find it very good in the early game. Even though it attacks fairly slow, it still does high damage. And with the autocannon not being restricted to just one area of fire, similar to the minigun, this one does really, really well a lot of the time. You will kind of have to move your person when shooting this, though, because when the autocannon does pick an area to fire at, it can't move from there, so it's not going to be targeting anything else. You do have to just kind of keep running back and forth so that the bullets keep going in that direction that you want them to go in. Then we've got Engie up next, and Engineer's first class is called Maintenance Worker. This is unlocked at total level of 5, so you can unlock this pretty early on too. And Maintenance Worker starts out with the LMG platform guns. These are just turrets that you normally have in the regular Deep Rock game, where you toss them down and they shoot any sort of enemy that's nearby. They're very similar to something like the GK2, but you do get multiple of these, and if you stop, then your person will toss these out. If you're still running, you can toss one out every once in a while, but if you stand in place for just a second, your person will start placing them around them. So sometimes that's a good strategy to do with this class. And what's unique about this class is that you get plus 10% damage and reload speed for all construct weapons. So this is everything. That's your turrets, that's your drones, any of the other turrets that they added to, like the Krakatoa Sentry. You can upgrade them, or anything like the Lightning Fence or the Repulsor Fields. You get more access to them and they do more damage and reload quicker. Maintenance Worker is honestly probably the most consistent of the Engie classes, in my opinion. Like, the turrets already start out really strong. They have good upgrades, and if you just want to upgrade them, they can just carry you all the way through the game. And since this gives you more, essentially, turrets and drones and stuff, if you stack the regular turrets with like the Krakatoa turrets, and then you have some sort of drone that's going around, maybe acid or cryo ones or fire ones or whatever you want, and then you have like an electric fence or a size repulsor. The repulsor's actually really good with maintenance Engie. Like you put that down next to your turrets, and sometimes you can have your turrets follow you. Maintenance Worker actually works really well in a lot of situations, and I find them to be pretty consistent all throughout. Then we've got Tinker Engineer, and Tinker Engineer is kind of a cool one. This one's unlocked to level 9 for Engie, and Tinker Engineer starts out with the Warthog Auto Shotgun. This one is pretty strong, although it does only shoot forward, so it's not necessarily one of the strongest weapons, just because of that. Although if you get plasma on the Warthog, it's actually really strong, because then it doesn't matter which direction it's firing, because it bounces around. And the Warthog does really high damage. It also has knockback on it by default, similar to the Boomstick, which is really good. As well as if you want to upgrade it and you get something like plasma, increased range, and then like the Akimbo on it, it's really scary then, because you're just dealing so much damage to everything in front of you, behind you, and around you, because the pellets are just bouncing around and doing so much damage. It can be really good then. Tinker Engineer's passive bonus is that you get plus 10% bonus XP whenever you gain XP. That's a pretty big bonus. That means you're going to be leveling up faster than any of the other classes, as well as it makes it so all weapons start out at level 3. So it's like you've already gotten 3 upgrades to your weapon, which does buff them slightly in terms of damage, but it makes it so whenever you do pick a new weapon or whenever you start out with a shotgun, you're that much closer to already getting an overclock for that weapon, which is pretty strong. It makes it so Tinker Engineer can max out pretty much all of their weapons in a run. Most of the time you don't do that, even with Tinker Engineer, but you really don't do it with the other classes. This one sometimes allows you to max out everything that you wanted to go with, and that can be really strong, especially if you get some of the stronger weapons right away, like you get the Breach Cutter right away, or the Shard Diffractor right away. Tinker Engineer can do a lot of damage, although I do find that they are probably the most hit or miss class of Ingies out of them, because even though this one does do fairly well against most things, sometimes you just don't get the greatest rolls, or sometimes you just get a bunch of upgrades that are just cosmetic upgrades, to where you'll still get like overclocks unlocked really quick, and some weapons that's all you need to make them really strong, but then other times it feels like you're not doing the most. So I'd put them there because they can have really high highs and not necessarily low lows, but a little bit lower than something like Maintenance Worker. I find that that one's a little bit more consistent than this one. And then we've got Demo Ingi. Demolish Ingi is also unlocked at level 18, and this one starts out with the Deep Core PGL Grenade Launcher. This is a really strong weapon. This is just, it points and clicks at anything nearby. It does high damage, and it has AoE on it. You can't hurt yourself in this game with any of these weapons, so that's pretty nice. And this also gives you access to other explosive weapons, so you get mostly like the thrown grenades in the game. And Demo Ingi's passive is that you also get plus 20% larger explosion radius and faster reload speed with all explosive weapons. Demo Ingi starts out with a pretty good weapon. The PGL isn't the craziest weapon in the game, but it is still very consistent. It's really nice. I don't know why they didn't give it nukes. I wish they would have given it nukes or hyperpropellant for its unstable, but either way, we still have some pretty good upgrades for it, and if you want to stack like all explosion radius, which is pretty easy to do with the Demo Ingi, and that can be super satisfying, like you get a ton of explosion radius, you get a ton of shrapnel damage, can be really good. If you're offered some of the thrown grenades, they can also be pretty good. Like the just the high explosive grenade can actually be pretty decent. Cryo grenades are insanely strong. The neurotoxin grenade can be pretty decent. So like you can actually get quite a few decent explosives and have a pretty strong setup for Demo Ingi. I'm going to put them in the hit or miss because I have had games where this has been absolutely insane and I can just have so much AoE and so much damage that nothing can get close to me. As soon as they walk into the explosion radius, everything's dead around me. And then other times I've had Demo Ingis where they give me kind of weird janky builds and they don't always work out the best. Like sometimes I end up having to make like some weird like elemental Demo Ingi that can sometimes work, but then other times I just feel like it's not really doing a whole lot because it's a whole lot of damage over time. Then we've got Drillers classes, and first up we have the Foreman Driller. So the Foreman Driller is unlocked at level 7. He is the last class that you'll unlock before you need to actually level up these classes individually to unlock their other subclasses. And Foreman Driller starts out with the Sabata 120 pistol. And normally the Sabata is not that strong in regular Deep Rock, but in this game it's actually pretty good because it can only shoot backwards, which is fine because the majority of the time enemies are going to be behind you. It also shoots out fairly fast and does okay damage. And since Driller can drill through walls faster, especially this class, it actually isn't that bad of a deal to have the pistol behind you. I wouldn't say it's a crazy weapon, but it's still a decent enough weapon. So the Foreman Driller's bonus is that you get plus 2% mining speed for 2 seconds every time that you're mining something, and this stacks up to 25 times. So you can have 50% faster mining speed just with Driller, which is really good, especially if you start getting a bunch of the scanners. Scanners are really, really strong with Foreman Driller. You get like a couple gold ones or a nitro one or a mix of both in the first couple rounds, and you buy basically everything and unlock everything for them. You get access to some pretty decent weapons. Like the Sabata is decent enough to start out with, but some of the other ones are really good too, like the Sludge Pump is fantastic. I think this has access to the Breach Cutter, at least it seems like one of Driller's does. So like you get some pretty good weapons, and Foreman Driller I think is actually probably the most consistent. Like you start out with one of the more consistent classes that's pretty good on just about every stage, because every stage is going to need to be mined, and if you just prioritize something like scanners and then just go for all the upgrades of whatever your preferred weapon is, you're probably going to have a pretty good time with them. Up next, we have the Interrogator Driller. Interrogator Driller is unlocked at level 9 as well. This one starts out with the Crisper Flamethrower, and the Flamethrower is not really one of my favorites for this game. It can be really strong, but it also is just an AoE where it just moves around you. It has 2 beams and it hits everything on either side. This can do decent damage and decent damage per second. It doesn't start out doing a whole lot, but it's okay. And then the unique passives for this particular class are that you get 100% bonus status effect damage, which is basically damage over time effects, but you lose out on 30% of your total damage, which it does kind of hurt if you forget that and you start going with weapons and building damage for them. This is much better if you're going for a full elemental build. You get like the flamethrower, you get the cryo cannon, you get the sludge pump, and then you get something else, whatever else you want on there. Something to give you more AoE damage, something to constantly tick down enemies, and this one can be really strong. However, I think I'm going to put this in the sometimes struggle, because sometimes this can have really high highs. Sometimes you just get all the AoE effects, sometimes you just get all of the damage over time effects and all the bonuses for elements, and this class is actually pretty solid, especially into the later game, if you can get to the later game. I find that it's very difficult to get to the later game with this class, though. I find that a lot of the time I'll die on like stage 1 or 2 just because I didn't really get a whole lot. And I just find that my damage and damage per second is just not enough to be taking out the elites. And that's kind of disappointing. That makes it so this class, if you can get past the first few levels, like you can get past stage 2, stage 3, you're probably going to have a really good time in stage 4 and 5. But if you are just struggling through stage 1, you may not be able to get through stage 2. And you're run in there and you'll just have to start again. Then you might be struggling on stage 1 and 2 again. So I find it to be probably the least consistent of the classes. Strong Arm Driller is the last of the driller classes, and this is unlocked at level 18. And this one starts out with the impact axes, which are kind of interesting because they count as explosive weapons technically in this game. So you throw them out, they hit, they deal damage to everything, and then once you've thrown somebody out, then they come back to you and they deal damage to everything that they've moved through. They also knock aside enemies with the axe, both when you throw it and when it comes back to you. So the impact axes can be decent. You can also put elements on them. You can have them be fire or have them be acid, which is kind of cool. But they're not really one of the best starting weapons in my opinion. They're a decent later game weapon to just add to your arsenal. And max leveling them out can be decent, but I don't find them to be the greatest. Bonus effect that the Strong Arm Driller gets is that you have bonus range as well as you get access to more throwing weapons. And if you stack all throwing weapons, Strong Arm Driller can be decent. It depends on which ones you get. If you get the Cryonade, then you're really good to go. Shredder drones can be pretty good. The lead bursters can be pretty decent sometimes. Regular HE grenades can be pretty good. Just depends on where you go with this one. But this one I also find is just like, it sometimes struggles. I think I'd put it there. I usually have more trouble with Strong Arm Driller than I do with Foreman Driller. This usually does better than like Interrogator Driller though. But then in the later game, Interrogator Driller is generally better than Strong Arm Driller, I find. Just because you've been able to stack up so many elemental effects. Whereas Strong Arm Driller, I still kind of find it sometimes inconsistent even into the later games. And looking at this, I think this is fine. I think this is okay. I would consider, yeah, like Scouts classes to go like that. Gunners are usually pretty consistent. Ingies can be pretty consistent. Drillers very heavily, besides like Foreman Driller is pretty consistent, so I think that this is where I would probably put them. Tell me your thoughts on this and where you would put all these classes, whether you find them very consistent or maybe not the most consistent but can do well, or it's just a class that you struggle with. I'd be really interested to hear that. Thank you guys so very much for watching this. Hope you guys enjoyed it. I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye, everyone.